Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. Prime Minister Narendra Modi on 23rd August 2024 held talks with Ukraine's President Zelensky in Kyiv, preceded by a visit to Moscow to the Russian President Vladimir Putin. After a one after the other visit to the two countries, which are in conflict, is rare, and even more unique is when it's the first time for an Indian head of state to do so since the establishment of diplomatic relations between Ukraine and India in 1992. This moment brings our attention to India's dynamic foreign policy, which is enabling it to walk this tightrope. To help in understanding this better and deconstruct Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to both Kyiv and Russia, joining me today is Professor C Raja Mohan, visiting research professor here at ISAS. Welcome, Prof. Mohan.
Thank you, Devyani. Great to be back with you.
Likewise, I always enjoy having these conversations, and I'm sure our listeners enjoy them too. So, to begin our episode for today, my first question to you is, how do you view Prime Minister Modi's visit to Kyiv? What do you think led to this trip?
Yeah, I think I was listening to your intro. I mean, one of the dangers for us in analyzing international events, we often tend to, see them in some kind of a grand design or a grand movement that is taking place. But in the real world of governments, I mean, things happen for scheduling reasons. Things happen because they have to be done, rather than that there was no. I don't think there was an initial plan that you got to do both these visits in a short, gap between the two. So I think the important thing is that Prime Minister Modi had not been to Moscow for almost 5 years. Because we used to have these annual summits with Russia, and in 2019, President Putin came to India, and then Prime Minister was supposed to go there in 2020. But I think because of the pandemic, successive meetings were cancelled, and that there was no occasion to hold this bilateral summit. So in some senses, by going to Russia, I mean, I think Prime Minister Modi was really reassuring India's Russian friends that look, India is not neglecting the relationship and would continue to take it forward. In many ways, it's interesting. I think, contrary to much of the conventional wisdom on the two visits, actually, by going to Russia, I think the PM made it easier for himself to be able to go to Ukraine, because given the special relationship with Russia, doing the Ukraine before going to Russia would have been more complicated. So in some ways, I would say this has worked out well, that India sent the right signal to Russia. And the fact is, engaging Ukraine has been on the cards for a long time, because no Indian Prime Minister had gone there for almost 30 years, ever since Ukraine came out of Russia, Soviet Union. And over the last 2 to 3 years, there's been a sustained engagement. We had the exchanges between the national security advisors of the two countries, between the two foreign ministers, and Prime Minister Modi himself had met President Zelensky on the margins of various international gatherings. So I think the visit was on the cards, and PM Modi, I think, took the opportunity of going to Poland in August, because the only way you can go to Ukraine these days is through Poland. So I think it worked out well in a way, the scheduling. In terms of the visit itself, I mean, I would say, I think, as we said, there's been no high-level bilateral engagement. So what we have now is a framework for expanding bilateral cooperation. Second thing I would say is, I think in India, the Ukrainian case for the war, why it is fighting it, and their determination to secure their territorial integrity and sovereignty, I don't think this case has been well understood in India, and that in turn has produced enormous grievances in Kiev. So I think by going to Kiev, by sharing the pain of this massive war that has gone on, and by listening to Zelensky and to Ukrainian counterparts, that in itself, I think, is a signal that, look, India is aware of Ukraine's case and that it empathizes with its quest for sovereignty. It also provided, I think the visit also provided Prime Minister Modi an opportunity to say that, look, India is not neutral, nor is it pro-Russia. Because many have viewed in the West that India's reluctance to criticize the Russian invasion in February 2022 either marks neutrality or it marks actually a pro-Russia position. I think from the very beginning, India did not endorse Russian invasion, but because of the long and complex and deep relationship, India has tended to avoid a criticism of Russia. But I think it continued to signal through the last many years. One, that the UN Charter on sovereignty must be upheld. Two, on the question of the war itself, Prime Minister Modi had insisted over the last 2 years that the both sides need to sit down and talk, and that there's no alternative to dialogue and diplomacy. So I would say the visit was about clarifying India's position to the Ukrainian friends, to make it clear where India stood, and to open up the bilateral track that had been frozen for a long time. And by signaling that, look, India is there for peace, India is on the side of the peace, I think Prime Minister Modi has created himself some room as we come to potentially a decisive phase in the way this war is going to evolve in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you. I think you have really laid a strong background to what could possibly be the reason for these trips and help us understand better on what these trips would mean for India's bilateral cooperation with Russia as well as with Ukraine. Now, I think you really focused on how this is not an if and or pace. And if you look at India's foreign policy, traditionally, the India-Russia partnership has been one of the key axes of Indian foreign policy. Now, there are several speculations also about how Prime Minister Modi could emerge as a key peacemaker, and I would love to know your opinion a little bit more because this is one of the rare instances in the past 2-3 years where one of the key allies of Russia has actually so closely interacted with Ukraine. So we would love to know your thoughts more on that. At the same time, the simultaneous visit first to Moscow and then to Kiev, one is wondering what could be the conversations or what is the perception around Prime Minister Modi's visit to Ukraine in Moscow? Will India's cooperation with Kiev impact its partnership with Russia?
No, I would say on the first question, I mean, where you mentioned that on the question of India's role as peacemaker, I know that the media in India has actually gone to town about India's peacemaking role in this conflict. But I think the Indian side was making it quite clear that it does not want its role to be overestimated. That this notion that India is the one that is going to bring peace to the heart of Europe, I think is a highly mistaken notion. India does not have that kind of leverage. Even China, for that matter, does not have that leverage for two reasons at least. One, look, the Russia-Ukraine history is deeply intertwined. They have been part of one country. They have historic grievances and contestations. So they know each other quite well, as much as, say, India and Pakistan. So therefore, there's some outsider like India, can come and fix the problem, I think is fundamentally ahistoric. The second, I think, even more important, the question is, there's only one country with any significant leverage over this war, and that is the United States of America. Because if the US stops supplies to Ukraine, the war is over in no time. And if the US is willing to cut a deal with the Russians on the bigger questions of European security, that too will bring this war to an end. So President Putin knows very well that US is the key, and the way the US plays this out will be clearer when the November elections are held. In fact, as we speak, President Trump, in an interview to the Fox News, has said that, look, his predecessors, Obama and Bush, had pushed Russia closer towards China, and that the US should have a reasonable relationship with Russia. So, so I would say the real bargaining is between Washington and Moscow, and others. If they have a role, that is a marginal one, that is a secondary one, that is a supportive one, and not a central one of the kind that the Ukraine and Russia are not waiting for countries like India or China to parachute themselves and say, "Look, guys, we have a solution." I don't think that is the case. So I think Ukrainians understand it. I think what Ukraine was looking for was a better understanding of its arguments. As a leading country of the global South, it wants India to an India that it takes a more empathetic position towards Ukraine, would have a resonance in the rest of the global South. So I think what President Zelensky was looking was to gain more international support for his diplomacy of peace. As far as Russians are concerned, I mean, I think there was a Russian foreign ministry reaction when asked about what do they think, would it affect India relationship with India? No, there's no question. Look, Russia needs India as much as India needs Russia. Therefore, just because Prime Minister Modi went to Ukraine, Russia is not going to cut off its relationship with India. And in fact, they said they welcome India's interest in the issues, and they would like to stay engaged with India. So I don't think the Russian anger or frustration is by no means a reality. Russia has, of course, dealt with a whole number of countries trying to insert themselves into this conflict. China itself has a peace plan. We saw Turkey play a key role. So I don't think they resent any Indian initiative here. And in any case, we said India is not claiming a special role. It simply wants to engage both sides and support in whatever form it can potential peace outcomes in Central Europe.
Thank you. I think that really highlights what possible role India can play and also brings to light what India's possible objectives in its interactions with Ukraine and Russia can be. And I think you really point to a very interesting aspect of how Ukraine requires more empathy or is looking for more empathy from India, given that it's such an important part of the global South. I think it's an interesting moment, these two visits in Indian foreign policy, also because it marks I mean, when I talk about these two trips, I mean the one
Hmm.
to Kiev and also the one to Poland, which you rightly mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. I think what it depicts is India's increasing engagement in Central and Eastern Europe, one that India has always been slightly hesitant to intervene in. So I think it's important that we learn from you what factors, according to you, are driving this engagement, and what is India striving to achieve from its increased engagement in the region.
I think one of the uh, tragedies of India's foreign policy has been that the lack of sufficient engagement with Central Europe. It's interesting that because through the British Empire period, I mean, I think India tended to engage really the Europe, saw Europe through British eyes, and did not much directly deal with the other countries. Post-independence, of course, India has stepped up its relationship with Germany, with France, and other big European countries. But it did not really think of because of the Cold War, because of the East-West division, did not think geopolitically about Central Europe. During the Cold War, one of the interesting things was because of India's relationship with the Soviet Union, Delhi had a preferential access to Central Europe, where the Central European countries who were part of the Warsaw Pact were also friendly to India just because Soviet Union was a friend of India. So India had much engagement with the Central European countries in the communist era. But unfortunately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, India could not or did not sustain that engagement with Central Europe. In fact, while the weight of Central Europe grew because of economic reforms, they became part of Western Europe. Many of them joined NATO. So in some ways, even as the uh, Eastern Europe's weight grew in the world stage, India had not really reached out or engaged them. So that's what this visit in part was to correct that. After all, no Prime Minister of India had visited Poland for 45 years. So in some ways, as Prime Minister himself told the diaspora in Warsaw, look, it is his fortune to be the first one to do a lot of things in Indian foreign policy. So I think that recognition had emerged over the last few years that India needed to engage Central Europe. And within Central Europe, Poland is a major player, has been historically a major power. Today, it's coming back as a powerful actor in the geopolitics of Europe. So I think I would say one of the main outcomes of this visit to Warsaw and Kiev has been the recognition of Central Europe as a critical actor, as a potential market, as a business partner, as a partner in defense, and as a long-term, strategic calculus of India to build a multipolar world. That India traditionally was focused on the old Europe. Now, I think with this visit, I think we see the new Europe, to use a coinage in Washington that was created under President George W. Bush, the new Europe that came out of Soviet Union, that region today has acquired its, I think, rightful place in India, a rising India's mental map.
Absolutely. I think this transition from focusing on the four European powers that India centered on, which, as you rightly mentioned, were the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and to a certain degree, Italy, and the movement away from that and focusing on Poland and Ukraine and basically a post-Soviet deconstruction of that area, I think it really brings to light why India is increasingly engaging in the region. And although in your previous answer you did kind of touch upon what the major takeaways are, but I would be really grateful if you could also just point out what the significance of these set of trips meant, not just for India, but also globally, and what should be our key takeaways.
No, I mean, I would say that, for example, as India seeks to, build a multipolar world, I mean, that the traditional focus has largely been in our debate is really between US and China, and Russia as a partner in building this multipolar world. But I think over the last few years, certainly under Prime Minister Modi, the recognition of Europe as a strategic actor has grown significantly. In fact, Prime Minister Modi and Foreign Minister Jaishankar have really elevated the engagement with Europe to a higher level, just going by the frequency of the visits, the number of heads of state and government that are received in India, and the number of times Prime Minister Modi traveled to Europe. This is quite unprecedented, because neither the Manmohan Singh government nor the Vajpayee government or the Narasimha Rao government, and we're not talking about the pre-reform era, paid no attention to really very little attention to Europe. So I think that's a big change. That engaging Europe, which is a major economic actor, is important for us. And Delhi also sees Europe has a lot of technologies to offer. So therefore, engaging all parts of Europe then has become a strategic priority. Second, I think in very specifically in relation to Central Europe, that this is region where actually the which kind of breaks the image of whole of West Europe is one unit. Poland has a worldview of its own. It wants more strategic autonomy from Brussels. So I think as India's quest for strategic autonomy and multipolarity also means many countries of Central Europe, they have a perspective which is not what you get in Brussels or what you get in Paris or London. So therefore, I think connecting with this space became very, very important. The third thing I would say on defense, because many of these countries were operating the Russian equipment until recently, and many of them actually are in a position to help India to make the transition from Soviet era equipment to a more Western style equipment. Ukraine itself, for example, has been a major supplier of engines for India. So I think the legacy industry that exists in Central Europe, the defense industry, some of it India can take advantage. And at the same time, as India builds its own, you know, more national, self-reliant defense industrial infrastructure, there's a lot of room for collaboration with countries like Ukraine and Poland, and even smaller countries like Czech Republic, Hungary. A lot of them have interesting things to offer. So I think the right political perspective would also make it easier for India to access these regions. And then, of course, it's a market, is an important market for us. And we've seen India reach out to different corners of Europe because, as we said previously, either you dealt with Brussels or the big three, the improvement in the relationship with Italy, Greece, with the Nordics. So you have now an India that is engaging the sub-regions of Europe. So I would say the Central Europe is the last of the sub-regions that India has not engaged. And I think this visit actually begins to take a more sub-regional view of Europe and to engage with this region, which is really in the front line of the conflict between Russia and the West.
Thank you. I think that is very insightful. Just to kind of summarize a little bit of what you said, I think because this is quite interesting. You talk about how India has used these trips as an opportunity to strategically reprioritize and focus on Central Europe. At the same time, look at strategic autonomy, aspirations, and ambitions of Central European countries like Poland, and look at future cooperation in defense and look at the region as a market in a whole. So, if I had to ask a subsequent question on this, how do you see India build on these trips in the future? And in alignment with India's vision of a multipolar world, how do these trips reflect on India's ambitions as a global power?
I think is the more differentiated view that Delhi is taking now comes at a time when Europe itself is going through a big churn. The assumptions about the last 20 years in terms of Europe's relationships with the US, with Russia and China are all undergoing change. And within Europe, the relationship between the major actors within Europe, that's also changing. So I think India steps in at the right time. And we must be very clear, this is just the beginning of a long process where India connects with Europe in a more purposeful and in a more, shall we say, geopolitically sensitive manner than we've done before. Second, I think, is the whole question of the new initiative that India has taken, for example, on IMEC, that is the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. This, I think, a lot of Eastern Mediterranean countries like Greece and Italy are very interested in this. And I think in India that manages to develop this connection can also connect with the Poland's plans for a Central European corridor, not just the East-West corridor, but the North-South corridors. So that is the new dynamic that so far we've thought about entering Europe or Eurasia through Iran and then Russia. But I think this new IMEC, which goes through Saudi Arabia and then connects to the Mediterranean, opens up a new possibilities for India to be able to engage Eurasian region through partnerships with both the Gulf countries as well as with the Central European countries. A third, I think, is over the longer term. I mean, India must see itself as playing a role in Europe because we have forgotten mostly in India that the Indian resources, the Indian army played a big role in the first and the Second World Wars. But I think we've thought of Europe since independence as some kind of a separate theater with which we have nothing to do with. But today, I think, given China's growing role in Europe, it's the main facilitator of the war in Ukraine. You have Iran supplying weapons to Russia. You have North Korea supplying ammunition to Russia. You have South Korea selling arms to Poland. So what you have is actually a greater interpenetration of the geopolitics of Europe and Asia. And I think for India, the challenge is that it can't simply ignore this trend. It must be part of this trend, and it must reclaim a role for shaping the Eurasian landmass, and not merely through SEO, but also in greater collaboration. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also in collaboration with the Central European states.
Thank you, Prof. Mohan. I think the key word that has stuck to me through this whole conversation is that we're at a time where there is greater penetration of Asia and Europe, and India's visit is a stark example of that. And we see more and more alignments and alliances coming together to support that. So thank you so much for your time today, and we really greatly appreciate your insight.
Thank you, Devyani. My pleasure to be here.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.